10 years ago, in response to a crisis, the then Prime Minister said, "We're all in it together." But a decade of public service cuts tell a different story. It tells a story of the working class paying the price for a crisis not of their making, our services being run to the ground, and our NHS being pushed to the brink. Madam Deputy Speaker, that has left us more vulnerable to this pandemic. As the chairman of the British Medical Association said earlier this month, after a decade of underfunding, and I quote, "Our starting position has been far worse than many other European nations." We see that with the NHS staff confronting this crisis without the resources they need. They don't have the proper protective equipment, the ventilators, or the tests they deserve. Frankly, that's a scandal. And before I go on, I want to put on record my thanks and admiration to the NHS staff at University Hospital, Coventry and Warwickshire, and across the country. Their bravery, dedication, and self-sacrifice at this time is an inspiration. And if we are to learn one thing from this crisis, I hope it is that no one will ever again undervalue or underfund them and our NHS again. And this emergency has already taught us something. It has taught us who our key workers are. And it's not the bankers or the city traders, it's the nurses, the doctors, the cleaners, the shop assistants, the teachers, the bus drivers, the carers, the postal workers, the delivery drivers. It's the 99%. It's the working class in all of our diversity. This crisis shows that society is nothing without the labouring class. But just as the financial crisis showed us, it's the working class who risk being hit hardest by this crisis. Belatedly, the government is appreciating the scale of the economic challenge, but it's not going far enough, fast enough. It's allowing bosses to force staff to work even in non-essential areas. If we're fining individuals for going out when they shouldn't, surely it's right to find businesses that tell their staff to come into work when it's unnecessary. And while the job retention scheme offers support for businesses, it gives no guarantees workers will be able to retain their jobs. It doesn't cover the 5 million self-employed, from actors to taxi drivers. And while the Chancellor has promised further measures, they should never have been excluded in the first place or left with fear of their incomes disappearing overnight. So I urge the government, extend this scheme to the self-employed before they're pushed into poverty. And Madam Deputy Speaker, poverty is what it would be, because at £94 a week, universal credit is simply not enough to live on. The Secretary of State for Health and Social Care himself has admitted to this, and it's the whole system that's broken. We're seeing that at the moment, with reports that online queues for universal credit are 150,000 people long, and it's taken days to move forward just a few thousand places. This is what happens when you gut the social security system. It's about time this broken system was fixed and funded properly. So again, I urge the government, before more people are driven into totally unnecessary poverty, end the 5-week wait, suspend all sanctions and raise the universal credit rate to a livable rate. And our social security system must be extended to people currently excluded from it. Before this crisis, no recourse to public funds was an injustice. But during this pandemic, it is a public health calamity. Migrants must be given access to healthcare, vital public services and financial support. So the government must end no recourse to public funds. The final point I want to touch on, Madam Deputy Speaker, is renters. Last week, we called on the Chancellor to suspend rents and ban evictions, and ministers promised our concerns would be swiftly met. But we're still waiting. The government's announcement on evictions was inadequate to start with and has only disappointed on closer inspection. It's not a ban on evictions, it only extends eviction notices to 3 months. And evictions are going ahead right now, as the charity Shelter has warned. Madam Deputy Speaker, you cannot stay at home if you're being kicked out of it. So again, I urge members opposite, live up to your promise and ban evictions throughout this crisis. But banning evictions alone is not enough. If rents aren't suspended, then debts will pile up and renters will be at the mercy of landlords when this outbreak subsides. The government has asked landlords to show compassion, but if there's one thing I've learned after years of renting, you can't rely on the compassion of landlords. So I tell the government, suspend rents before it's too late. Madam Deputy Speaker, I will finish on this. Yesterday it was reported that banks are exploiting this crisis, putting up the costs of personal loans, quadrupling interest rates on overdrafts to nearly 40%, and failing to pass on the Bank of England's interest rate cuts. We bailed them out when they crashed the economy, and we paid the price. We can't let that happen again. So I urge the government, this time, let's bail out the people, protect the incomes of the self-employed, raise statutory sick pay for all workers, increase universal credit, end no recourse to public funds, suspend rents and ban evictions, and make sure that working people aren't hit the hardest ever again.